Since coming out of schools and using terminology rather loosely, although I'd like to think I explained myself reasonably well if I was encouraging staff to do something in a particular way, but I still think there's an element of superficiality about it, that we were doing it to a certain amount because I persuaded the staff in my school that when I was talking about project-based learning, it meant this, when actually we should have had the conversation at the start, a bit like we're doing now with phenomenon-based learning or phenomenology, by saying, so what exactly do we all understand that to mean?
Exactly.
And I think that's an absolutely essential part of any piece of professional learning that we do. And where I am at the moment, you asked me about relating us to face-to-face. What the issue that I've got about learning to be a better online teacher, getting the learning that occurs within my groups to be more effective, more meaningful, has caused me to look much more widely at just what I do in an online environment. It's getting me to think about, what do I understand teaching and learning to be? What kind of learning is going to work best for these students? What I found with phenomenon-based learning, for example, as I understand it, is to encourage them in the same way that you would use it in Finland to work collaboratively with others and share their understanding to cross borders, to also follow their interests, their enthusiasm, their passion. And in fact, I would say that what I've done in the classroom would be more about passion projects, where they became so interested in them, they couldn't stop talking about them. So they couldn't stop sharing their thoughts and their enthusiasm with others. And when as soon as there were 2 or 3 of them that had the shared passion, there was no limit to what they could learn, because off they went. That's what I would like to try to recreate in an online environment, if I possibly can. So my openness to teaching in different ways is what's changed in face-to-face. Instead of rather than accepting that what I've done before has worked quite well, and therefore I'll carry on doing it that way, I'm actually now questioning, is there a better way of doing this? I wouldn't necessarily have done that to the same extent as I am doing now. And this is 50 years after I started teaching, which I can't believe. 50 years after I started teaching, I'm now thinking, there's got to be a better way of doing this. Yeah. I don't think I wasted the last 50 years. I think I've been learning all the time, but it's it's so exciting to if you accept the fact that you are still a learner as a teacher, and this is what has come out of some research I was involved in earlier this week, and it was all about teachers admitting that when they're working in an online environment, they also become the learners. And that's where I am at this point in time.
But yeah, that's very true. Everything you said is very true. There's another catchword: you are a lifelong learner.
Yeah.
Being a teacher,
Yeah.
as well. But now I beg a concrete example from you of one of your assignments where you feel that your students have become passionate. Can you just show it or explain it?
I explain it. I haven't got anything prepared to show, but maybe I can explain and try and put it into words fairly succinctly, rather than tell you too many long stories. I think the fact that students, when they come onto my course, come from many different places. They have been doing their level 4 and level 5 foundation degree, like the first 2 years of an undergraduate program, the equivalent to first 2 years of an undergraduate program, in many different places. Then they come to me, to Staffordshire University, on our what we refer to as the top-up course, which is the final year, the level 6 final year, so they can get their honours, their Bachelor of Education honours degree. And they come with anticipation, fear, excitement, all these emotions. And I have to, as quickly as possible, help them to overcome their fears, or allay their fears, put their fears to one side, to encourage their excitement, to give them something to become excited about. And so right from the very start, our first module, I say to them, I've provided you with a framework for exploring, and I've recently changed this in the context of how it would work better in an online environment. So this is a very useful piece of opportunity to say that we had previously studied legislation that had happened in the past, and the interest for the students is that they can choose which aspect of education they would like to study historically, to look at the legislation to see how it's impacted on the aspect that, so if they are special needs teachers, if they were teachers of mathematics, or they had a particular interest in safeguarding and child protection, if that was their role, part of their role within the school, or if they were particularly interested in curriculum development and assessment, they could choose that aspect. And one of my students, I'll use her as an example, is a teacher. She's a French teacher who's working in England, but she teaches English as an additional language. And we have found it quite difficult to find legislation and key reports around English as an additional language. So she and some of her colleagues on the course and myself have had to go hunting for important reports. We've found by unearthed, we've discovered some very interesting pieces of writing from some time ago about the importance of English as an additional language. And she's become so enthused about this because what she had assumed was something she needed to do in a particular way, she's found all of a sudden some ideas from the past that have been really influential. So why it becomes really, it touches on their passions, which one of hers in particular, and why we're changing the course is we used to focus, or I used to focus on the legislation and analyzing the legislation, which is, yeah, I agree. Yeah, not too inspiring. So what we've done is we've actually said, well, let's have a look at your practice and let's think of one aspect of your practice, and then let's go and see something, a report that you can find, or a piece of research, or something that might be connected with legislation that you can see that actually relates to your practice as it is now, or as you might want it to be, so that it might actually inform changes that you might want to make. So they are still looking at legislation or research from the past, but they're being very selective about it, and they're doing it in the context of their practice now. That is bringing things much more to life for them, and I would suggest as probably moving us towards more of a proper phenomenon-based approach.
Yes, I like that very much, this example, because there are many things that I feel are important that you realize in this assignment. First of all, this opportunity for the students to choose. They make the decision what I'm interested in, what is useful for me, and the even maybe a bigger issue that it's not always the same for everybody. This is the traditional teaching. This is the content that everybody needs to master the way I, the teacher, have decided to master it. And this reminds me of my course on educational policy and practice. I'll quickly show you the learning objectives so that you see how difficult it is. Okay. It's a really difficult course.
Well, while you're looking for those learning objectives, is it okay if I say something that I think would be relevant to this? I've found that one of the most exciting things for me now as a teacher is being given the challenge of interpreting the learning objectives in a way that works for what it is that the student wants to say. And it's really interesting, because I feel now the responsibility for me to get the learning objectives articulated, written down in a really useful way, which is what I think is must be such a step forward. And I suspect, in fact, looking at what you've written down now, they're much more accessible than maybe ours are, which are written in academic terms
I
for
know.
academics. And I'm thinking, what use are these? So my challenge, one of my challenges rather, is around making the learning objectives useful rather
Yeah.
than just a barrier to learning.
Yes, and I'm glad you brought that up, because I was reminding myself we need to go back to what you said in our previous video about the learning objectives being accessible, because this is really a drastic change that has happened since we in Finland in higher education started competency-based education. So one of the results of this is that the learning objectives and the assessment criteria must first of all be aligned, but they must also be written in the language that students understand, and not the kind of academic slang.
Yeah.
Or one of my colleagues calls the traditional curriculum like curriculum poetry. Nobody understands. But we could have another session about this constructive alignment in teaching and learning, and Jori could join us there.
And there's my big takeaway from this conversation. Constructive alignment, I
Yes,
think, is a really good theme.
there's a really good book by Bix and Tang. It's called Quality Teaching for University Learning, or something like that. But it's about constructive alignment from the beginning. But let's finish with this theme. Just look at these objectives. This is called Educational Policy and Practice course, master's level course, and this is what they need to. I haven't actually written these objectives and contents, but the degree program leader has written these. But you can see that they are rather demanding. Appraise the various dynamic processes in which educational policies are developed, implemented, and evaluated. It's a lot already in the first objective. And then evaluate the impact of various stakeholders on the formation and development of educational policy, and so forth. And the first thing that is really difficult for students to really understand is what is educational policy.
Well, it's really interesting you say that, Cisco, because the starting point for me, and this is a really interesting point. Maybe we do need to leave it soon, but maybe we can pick up on this. My course would be similar in terms of the objectives. You quite rightly identified something, similar to this opening module. And we start with definition, purpose of education. We explore what do you mean by education, what is meant by, what do people mean by, what is its purpose, and how does that purpose change according to people's different stakeholders' perspectives, and how does that lead into policy, or to what extent does policy actually reflect the purpose of all the stakeholders, or has it come down just to certain one or two types of stakeholders? And the interesting shift in the way of approach is, instead of asking them to write about that from an academic point of view, I've now encouraging them to include that thinking when they're exploring it within their own context.
Exactly.
So they don't have to think about it as a separate piece of writing they've got to do. They actually include it where it feels natural within their own exploration of how policy is, what their purpose is for education, and how that might be different from the parents of the children that they're working with, or from the children themselves, or from the head teacher of the school, or never mind the politicians. And it's really starting to open their minds, but in the context of a meaningful context for them, rather than just in a dry academic context. Very, very interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah, and this is exactly what we do on this course, but remembering that it's an international course and English is not the native language of all the students. So for example, the word policy has so many meanings. So we need to start from the very beginning. We do this exactly the same thing you've done with your students. To achieve all these learning objectives, they can choose a topic within the educational policy of their context. The first assignment is to follow the media discussion, like what seems to be the current topics. And then they find a topic. It doesn't have to be in the media discussion currently, but they usually are passionate about something, like for example, sexual education, or whatever the level of their own teaching and learning, where in what kind of school they are teaching. They find their topic which they're very passionate about, and they look at all of these through their own topic in their own context, and then they compare the same topic with their colleagues in different contexts. That's really interesting for them, how it's done in another country, for example. So this is exactly the same we do that you explained about.
Well, that's their next module, is actually looking at contexts of what they're interested in, but in another country. So so we're obviously thinking along similar lines in terms of making it a worthwhile extension, maybe extending their thinking beyond what they might have thought before, but it's still within their control because it's still around something that they can relate to. Therefore they don't necessarily feel safe. In fact, I like to think they feel challenged with their thinking, but they're at least they're not being put into a completely unfamiliar environment in order to consider, to start exploring their learning in more depth. And that's the thing I want them to do. I don't want them to be frightened into not taking some risks with what they want to write about. I want them to feel encouraged to take risks with what they want to say, and rather than to play safe. And that's interesting to see as they develop during the progress of the course.
And empowering the students to trust themselves, and feeling that they can have an impact. They can have an impact on educational policy. They can have an impact on legislation if they work for it.
Absolutely.
Okay, Steve, you always summarize it so well. So can you summarize this discussion at the end?
We've actually started from the point that phenomenology is different, appears to be different in Finland than in England. But I think we've come to the conclusion at the end. There's so much similar to what we're doing, and actually taking the time out to explore what we mean by something and listening to what people are saying and relate it to our own experiences is a principle that we are passing on to our students as well, to get them to do the same thing. I think we've just done that with phenomenology, in talking about that and phenomenon-based learning. I don't think we've necessarily finished doing that, but we've opened that door to having that discussion about what exactly that means, what exactly that looks like. And I'd like to think that that's what this series of videos is all about: sharing experiences of our practices, learning from one another, and modelling the fact that we've all got something to learn, no matter how long we've been doing it.